make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
In the United States, Christianophobia, though, tends to manifest itself against conservative Christians. And the reason why that is that the groups that tend to have the cultural power, at least up to recently, have been more progressives who tend to have Christianophobia. The research shows that people who are more politically progressive, who don't go to church, who are white, who are wealthy, who are educated, who are male, they're more likely to have Christianophobia.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. What's going on, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
And today we have joining with us Dr. George Yancey. He's a professor of sociology at Baylor University, whose work focuses on race relations, faith, and cultural polarization. He's developed a Christian model for racial reconciliation that moves beyond both colorblindness and anti-racism, offering what he calls a better way forward. His research also explores anti-Christian attitudes in the U.S. and how believers, both conservatives and progressives, can find common ground in an increasingly divided culture. And we're just so glad to have him here with us today. So thanks for joining us, George.
It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I think I mentioned this to you in the email when we reached out to you. We had a listener of the show recommend that we speak with you, a listener who watches your YouTube channel and said, hey, this is somebody I think that would be a perfect fit for your show. So I reached out to you and now you're here and you have a YouTube channel. So before we kind of jump into it, what's your YouTube channel about?
Well, it's called Shattering Paradigms. And basically, I wanted a space for Christians who don't feel comfortable, with one party or the other. I'm not saying that you have to be independent. You may be a Republican who has some questions or a Democrat has some questions. My videos run the gambit. If you have a sacred cow on either side, it's going to get speared. So I'll probably, even people who are independent, I'll probably piss them off sometimes too. But that's fine, because my thinking is that political ideologies are socially constructed. They're not given from on high. And I respect people whose beliefs on both sides. I mean, I have issues where I'm pretty conservative on and those I'm pretty progressive on. I'm not comfortable with either political party. But we shouldn't let that political ideology dominate our faith. We should, our identity should always be in Christ first, and then politics can flow out of that. And sometimes I get the feeling, and I found this on both sides, that Christians have let their politics become first, and then it feeds into their faith. And so that's kind of my idea. The topics vary, but they center around the things that I've done research in for the most part. I've done a few videos on Charlie Kirk lately because of what happened and some of the interesting dynamics that are happening. I've not done research in that area, but usually, even though I do have some one-offs, they revolve around things that are interest to me as far as research, which I find interesting to a lot of people: race relations, anti-Christian bigotry, identity politics. I've also opened up a front on white progressives, which I think is really interesting and an understudied area. So that's sort of my spiel on my channel.
I love it. Yeah, it's funny. I think Josh and I kind of feel pretty much the same when it comes to political parties. I mean, I generally vote Democrat and he generally votes Republican, but I wouldn't necessarily call myself a part of the Democratic Party per se, because I think that political parties have a purpose, right? Coalitions help get stuff done, right? So it's if I want something, it's I'm going to hitch my wagon to the Democrat horse because somewhere along the lines, I'll get the things that I want. I mean, and the same thing for the Republicans. So I totally am with you on we should prioritize our identities. In other words, if you are a Christ follower, that should be sort of the first thing in your title, right? And then anything else after that. So I am curious though. This seems like a very specialized field. And it seems like a field that I haven't met anybody else that's really studying it much like you are. So like, what is it about sort of, this political dynamic, pull and push, and then you layer on the faith element? Like, what was it that got you into this, that you wanted to make a career out of it?
Well, I mean, as a Christian going into sociology, I think I bring a different view of things that other sociologists don't have. Or I'm not saying no other sociologist in the whole world has my view on things, but I do think I bring something different because, as you probably know, sociology is a pretty secular field, and so I think as I've gone on, I've never been a member of a political party per se. I do have a friend who is in Congress. And so the only time I've ever given money to a political party was given to him because he's an ex-roommate. And I know and I trust him. I don't trust most politicians, so I don't always agree with him, but your ex-roommate asks you for money. Come on, man. Otherwise, I just feel that my faith transcends that, and that's naturally, for me, going to lead me to agreeing with Democrats sometimes, agreeing with Republicans sometimes, and to me, that's how it's, and I don't ever want to be sort of shut into that. Now, my studies, I don't study political ambiguity per se, but the solutions I tend to come up with, like on racial issues. If you read my book and you read it as someone who's committed to anti-racism, you may be offended by it. If you read it, someone committed to colorblindness, you may be offended by it. Because I think there's a better way than that. I think there's a way that's driven within our Christian walk that allows us to transcend those things. And those things, and I document my book, have serious weaknesses. So, and I'm not saying that I figured it all out, that my path has no weaknesses whatsoever, or I'm not going to be that arrogant. But I do think there's a better path in what we're doing. And so I think that Christ leads you to a better path. And another thing on my channel is my belief is that truth is truth. Theological truth is true. Scientific truth is truth. And if we're honest, a lot of times we prep one to fit the other. But I think we try to go for both, then we'll have a better chance of finding, what's true and what's real.
I really appreciate that. Thinking about your work as a sociologist, I would love to dig into your method a little bit because, right, you have the sociologist method, right, the standards they have for how they do research. I'm thinking like surveys, interviews, theories that are out there, like how they move from causation or correlation or any of these things, interpreting data, right? So there's certain steps that sociologists, people take, statistics, interviews, observation, stuff like that. You have that on one side, and then you have, maybe it's not one side, but you have that within, and then within this larger framework, maybe of you are Christian, right? And and you have your views, and you want to bring the categories of faith to bear on the categories of sociology. How do we do that without committing a category error or misrepresenting the data?
So the things that you're talking about, surveys or interviews or participant observation or factor analysis or content analysis, those are just tools. They don't have moral values in themselves any more than a car does. So a car can take you to church or a car can take you to the bar. Car could take you to do service. Car could take you to look for hookers. The car is just a tool. The car is not evil in and of itself. It's not good in itself. These are just tools. My Christian faith tells me about sociological methodology to the same degree it tells me about how to operate a car.
And you can drive a car if you're a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist, right?
Right,
it's a tool that you can use, and we use the tool in the same way. We hit the gas, we hit the brakes, right? I like that analogy. Sorry.
Now, my Christian faith what it does tell me, though, and here I think is the biggest difference between Christianity and the secular ideology. The difference is not what do you believe in God or not, because there are people who are secularly believe in God. The difference is what is the nature of humans. If you believe the nature of humans is basically good, chances are you have a secular ideology. If you believe that we are fallen creatures, then you have a Christian ideology. I think there's massive implications to that I don't think I've hardly ever seen anyone really talk about.
I
Because
agree.
your belief in what humans, are humans perfectible or are they not? I mean, the implications of that are incredible. And I've
Huge.
thought that if I ever lived this life over again and became a theologian, that would be what I would write upon. The implications of, are humans perfectible or not? Because how you treat humans goes along those lines.
I'm curious about this Christian model for race relations. Can you talk about that and what is it used for and how is it used?
Sure. Okay, so going back to humans perfectible or not. If humans are not perfectible, and I don't believe humans are perfectible, I believe in human depravity, then none of us have all the right answers. The person who's doing anti-racism does not have all the right answers, neither does the colorblind person. So in a fallen society, we have to learn how to work together. That means what we need is to find better conversations. And when I say that, I know some people already go, oh no, not another one of those conversations where I get beat over the head. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about conversation where we learn how to listen to one another, learn how to communicate in ways in which people can hear us, so that we can find solutions for whatever problems at hand. In this case, racial problems. So let's take immigration, for example. For me, an ideal setting, instead of having, the Republicans coming in and grinding people up and and Democrats, and I'm overgeneralizing, I recognize this, okay? Or Democrats protesting and stuff like that. If we could sit down and say, okay, what concerns you about immigration? What concerns you about removing immigrants? I think that if we did that honestly in good faith over time, we'd probably develop a policy where neither group gets all that what it wants. There will be some removal, but not everyone. And if we did that, then people would have a buy-in that would not deepen racial hostility, but lessen racial hostility, because we've talked it through where we're finding better ways of doing that. Now, that sounds simple, but, most of us don't have the skills to have this sort of conversation. So we have to relearn. How do you listen to people where you're not automatically thinking that you're coming back while you're listening to them? How do you talk to someone where you're not immediately putting them on the defense so they can no longer hear you? That's something that we need to work on, I think, as a church and as a society, to deal with one racial issue at a time, until hopefully this becomes a pattern. This becomes the normal way we do things, that we listen to each other, we try to find solutions rather than going to war with each other.
I really do like that. And I love the idea that, because I start from the same standing point where I don't understand original sin. Like I understand it. That sounds like I've never thought about it. I do understand what original sin is theologically. I don't quite understand how it expresses itself. For instance, I tend to think of children as innocent, and that's been a thing that has been there for a long time.
Like kids?
I do have kids, and I do.
Still believe that?
I do believe it, but I do think, what I believe is innocent to the degree they shouldn't be treated as adults. And we recognize that legally. They don't have the mental capacity, all those different. But what does it mean? Again,
when I got kids, one of my best evidence for human depravity was raising my boys.
Dude, I hear you on that. My dad raised 4 boys, and I'm sure he's quite convinced of depravity to the nth degree.
As adults, so I got
yeah. And I do think there's definitely a mix. I don't think people are inherently good, although I do think God has proclaimed them good, right? So there is that in that image of God that was shared among humanity, and you even emphasized that. But really, my question with this, right, it's thinking about keeping on the race idea, the ideas of colorblindness and anti-racism, which you have criticized. And my question is, one, why are those bad categories for us to think in? And two, if you could respond to this, maybe a natural critique that someone might say, or challenge, the like, hey, great, both sides sounds great. People take responsibility. There's mutual obligation, but power's not mutual. And institutional power, it doesn't seem mutual. And it seems like more white Christians have more institutional power than Black Christians. And just kind of that whole idea of power that might maybe that the critical race theory, how that kind of comes in to this and those power dynamics. I don't want to muddy the water, but I do want to try to get this sense of colorblindness, anti-racism. Why are those bad categories? And how do you respond to that kind of objection?
Yeah, so, I mean, I could go into specifically critiques on each one, but let me sort of do it this way. There are times in which I am colorblind. For example, when I am grading my students' papers, I'm absolutely colorblind. I do not want to know their race. That means nothing to me as far as the grade they got. The grade they got, and I understand people come from different places, but hey, I don't do them any favors.
As it should be.
If I say, oh, it's a poor Black person, I'm going to give them 10 points, and then they go out and they can't do the job because they had professors passing them on. I'm absolutely colorblind. There are times where I'm anti-racist. Anti-racism has been very, despite its weaknesses, has been very good at spotting things such as privilege, things such as institutional discrimination. I mean, there are times where anti-racism works. So while they both have weaknesses, they both offer something. And so naturally, people have gone to these two ideas. The problem becomes when people go to these ideas and they think, okay, now everyone should be like this. And if you're not, I need to force it on you. And that's when depravity starts kicking in. Just give you a story. About 3 or 4 years ago, my oldest boy was getting to the age where racial issues was starting to become something he was more aware of. And I was thinking about how do I talk to him about this? And, there's a ton of stuff on how you talk to your kids about sex. So finding that wasn't that hard. How you talk to your kids about race, that stuff that I would feel comfortable with, currently fine. And so I went to that fountain of knowledge and wisdom, which is Facebook. And so I put a question out there, hey, if you have kids of color, how do you talk to them about race? And what I got, I did get some suggestions, but I also got several white people who came up and said, you should not be talking to your boys about race. You should not care about racism as good Black Christian boys, but as good Christian boys. Now, I put that out because I think it's kind of easy to see some of the anti-racism, some of the aggressiveness on how this idea that everyone should be anti-racist. But that's also true for the colorblind perspective. People colorblind believe everyone needs to be colorblind because when we do that, then we will have solved the problem. And here's the thing. I would say this to both. If your solution revolves around convincing everyone your solution is correct, your solution is not a solution because you're not going to do that. So you got to find a better way. And human depravity, our pride, our arrogance, it prevents that from happening. So what we got to do then is we got to figure out solutions where we bring people together instead of scattering people apart. And so that is a big part of how I see these things. Rather than critiquing them individually, what people do with them is a problem. What I talk about doing is bringing people together through communication. Now, the power piece, that is interesting, and that is something we have to take into consideration. We need to create a space where people can enter into. Now, the onus to create this space is on the group that has the cultural power. Now, I may surprise you all, but that's not always the whites. I'll go back to 2020. When it came to cultural power, the anti-racists had it. Everybody was anti-racist. Everyone wanted to be anti-racist. The two popular books was White Fragility, How to Be Anti-Racist. That was the group with the cultural power, but that was a group that was not interested in communication. Today, the colorblindness, they have the cultural power. They're going after DEI. Now companies that were anti-racist are saying, no, never mind. They have the cultural power. They have the responsibility because the group in power, if they are not willing to engage in that conversation, then you can talk among yourselves, but you're not going to really get that interaction where people can solve problems. So I think what has to happen is at some point in time, the group that has the cultural power is going to have to invite the others into a deeper conversation. And, how do we get there? I think as Christians, we should be aware of that dynamic and pray about that dynamic. But, it's not going to be an easy place, because usually when we have power, we don't want to give it up. And we feel it's right that we do have the power.
When you're talking about, how do you talk to your kids about race and stuff, it is an interesting question, because I've asked Josh this once. I was like, do you ever talk to your kids about race? like he's got a white family, and but I have a white wife, and my kids are mixed. And one of my kids looks more like my wife. The other one looks more like me. And even with just the two brothers, I heard my darker skinned son say, "You're not black, I'm black." and they were debating, and I'm just sitting back and I'm like, I don't really know what the right answer is, because they don't really know about genetics or DNA, and that's not the conversation I want to have. So it is really difficult, and there's not a lot out there, and especially for mixed race couples like myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is an area worth exploring. But I that wasn't my question. I wanted to just talk more about identity, especially identity as it pertains to politics and faith, because I'm sure it's not a surprise to anybody that Christians in particular seem to have attached themselves to each of the political parties, and probably more so on the right than on the left. But that's not to say that, those on the left on my side don't deserve critique. But on the right, it's like you are a Republican, you're an American, you're MAGA. And it's like, depending on who you talk to, how those identities are layered will vary. But I'm curious on what's the harm in that? So what's the harm in, identifying so strongly with, MAGA, who boast that they're believers or Christians or whatnot. So it's what's wrong with saying that I'm part of MAGA, but that MAGA identity also includes being a Christian?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. I will say this. I mean, I do think that historically it has been more on the left than the right, especially when you look at the modernist fundamentalist debates. Fundamentalists are debating whether or not we should be involved in politics. And it wasn't really until the rise of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority that you really saw a lot of participation. But I don't have any data, so I'm not going to say for certain. I do sense that's more on the right now than the left. But, I just want to be clear. It clearly was the other way around for quite a long time until relatively recently.
Yeah, well, on the right, definitely they have the infrastructure, probably more so than the left does today.
Right. But what I'm saying is that people on the right tend, and even today, I have seen some studies that show that conservative Christians are per capita are less involved in politics than progressive Christians. So I have seen it. Now, that doesn't say anything about the identity. I think there is a core of conservative Christians. Their identity is more MAGA Republican, and they are probably bigger. I say probably bigger than that core on the left, but I'm not sure about that. But anyways, your question, what's wrong with it? When you study social identity theory basically states that our identities is how we see ourselves, is how we know who's with us and who's against us. So we determine our out-group by those who are against our social identity. It meets certain critical needs for us. So that social identity, whatever it is, we will adjust to it. Okay, so now we have multiple social identities. My social identity is not just that I'm a Christian. I'm clearly an African American. I'm a Texan right now. I live in Texas. I'm just an American. I used to be an athlete. Maybe that's part of my identity. My body says no right now, but it's part of my identity. I used to be not a professional athlete, but I used to play sports all the time and stuff like that. So, I have multiple identities. My core identity is as a Christian. What that means is that whenever there's a conflict between that and anything else, my political identity, which right now I'm American Solidarity Party, when there's a conflict between that and anything else, the Christian identity wins. As much as I possibly can, that's the core identity. The other identities are out there and they're important. And, I'm never going to deny my African American identity, but I'm not going to ever say that's more important than my Christian identity. All right, so what happens then when your core identity is your political identity, be whatever it is, and this is not about which side is right or wrong, then that wins whatever conflicts with your Christian identity. And, one thing that's clear in the Bible is we're to put God before anything else. We put Jesus before anything else. And this is clearly comes out in Jesus' teachings. And I think Jesus taught that because he knew that when we put other things before them, those other things could be good, could be mostly good, but none of them are perfected in God. My Black identity is not perfected in the grace of God. It's part of who he's given me. It's nothing to be ashamed about. But, there are aspects about being African American that are great. There's aspects about my Black culture I'm not too proud of. So, that cannot be my central identity as a Christian. It has to be my Christian identity. And if anything in my Black identity conflicts with that, then it gives way to my Christian identity. If you do that with being a Republican or a Democrat, then you are giving the way you live, your faith away to being a Republican and Democrat. And I've seen that happen.
Yes.
I've seen that happen. And that distresses me because it kind of prevents us from coming together. I mean, there's this sort of idea now that if you don't vote the right way, you're not a Christian. And I'm like, where do we get that? Who taught you how you were saved? Who taught you how you're saved was that you had to vote for Harris or you had to vote for Trump. I mean, I just don't know where Christians are getting that unless their core identity is being a Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, so from my reading, I know that back in the day, there was a conversation Jerry Falwell Sr. had, and he was sort of comparing, then Carter, I think before he was president, or maybe he was president, but, sort of talking about that he's about as Christian as a tree or something like that, because he just believed all these different things. And like that just wasn't the starting point, but it was just an example of how, at least since, the political realignment of the 60s and 70s, how like Democrats were always viewed as not the right kind of Christian because, we weren't voting the right way. We weren't doing all this other kind of stuff. Even if we believe that in our hearts, our political vote is more of the altar call than anything. Yeah. So, yeah, I definitely think that there's something to it. But I am curious, though, like, so is the best way to view like our identity, our true or our primary identity, kind of like a coriander or a strainer, where like everything goes through it first, and then everything else kind of gets filtered by the other identities. Is that a good way to look at it, or is there a different way?
I hadn't quite thought of it that way before. I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking that. The sort of way that I've sort of thought about it is, if you have a theory about yourself, it's part of your identity. And then out of a major theory, you get postulates and corollaries to it. And so you have your core identity creates your basic theory, and then implications come out of that. And so let's use the example you just gave, because I've seen that. And I think I've seen it more lately than I have before. But I've seen where some people are saying, if you vote for a Democrat, you're not truly a Christian. I don't think that comes from a core identity of being Christ-centered. I just don't. And I don't want to say these people are not Christians, but I just don't see that. I think that comes from a core identity of either MAGA or Republicanism or something of that nature. And so when that becomes your core identity, a corollary of that is, to be a good person, you vote for Republican. Christian's a good person, so only Christians vote for Republicans. And I think that's how I see it. But I'm not saying that yours is wrong. I just hadn't thought quite that way before. I think there's value in thinking that how it's changed things out. But I guess I've always thought of it as, things emerge from it. Implications emerge from it, and then you live those out.
Yeah. It was probably a terrible metaphor, but no. That's what I hadn't thought about before. That means terrible. It's kind of like when I enter conversations or have interactions with people, I like to believe that my Christian faith is the first thing that they see. Not like, I'm handing them tracts or anything like that, but I'm not like coming at them hard, or I'm empathetic. I'm being very gracious. And so that's sort of like my first filter. And like everything else, like, so through that kind of like Christ-centered aura, I guess, that I'm presenting somebody, all the other sort of things are filtered through my faith. So like the way I talk about abortion, immigration, gun control, all the sort of hot button topics will be filtered through that faith colander. And maybe there's a better metaphor, but
I mean, I understand the metaphor that you're saying. Well, it makes sense to me. Filter something that essentially is the first pass that something comes through, and so some of those edges, it's like, it's something that is making that first pass understand: is this in line with my previous assumptions that I have that essentially make up my worldview? Like, for instance, if I assume God exists, this being exists, if I assume that the Bible is God's word or it has some kind of authority and all that, or if I assume, right, that all these assumptions then lead to someone, those essentially serve as filters. Because if I believe that God is true, anything that's trying to tell me or God exists, and that's a foundational belief, and anyone's trying to tell me that something is going to contradict with that, then I'm actually going to believe that first. Like, you can see it on the other side. For instance, if you don't believe a resurrection is possible because you don't believe miracles are possible, then you will never believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, because your assumption categorically excludes that option from the assortment of living options on the table for you. And so it doesn't matter how strained the evidence, it doesn't matter how much you're trying to, make your way around it, ad hoc, different, nuances. It doesn't matter how much you do that. You're never going to come to the place that God raised Jesus from the dead if you've excluded that from the beginning in an assumption. And so that's the assumption that really is the one that needs to be thought of, criticized, work through before there's this sense of, it's like, and those assumptions aren't necessarily, those aren't tools, right? We separate tools from assumptions. Like the tools that you're talking about, George, like there's a critical method to historical critical method. There's a critical method to exegesis of the Bible. There's a method, and what is that supposed to do? It's supposed to ensure the maximum amount of correspondence to reality from your interpretation of that, given the context and everything. And the talk about identity is so interesting to me, because I agree that the Christian identity should be the first thing. Absolutely. And yet even that Christian identity at times, that is even itself filtered, right? Mm-hmm. And even itself, right? It's almost like there's this, it's not a circle, maybe it's a spiral, maybe it's a reinforcing spiral. I don't know, but something like you learn that you're a Christian from a cultural situation that you're in, i.e. your family unit growing up. That's the first place most people learn that they're Christians, right? Unless they've come to faith later, which of course is something that happens. But many people, right, that's how they first understand it, and that identity, but that's also a culturally shaped identity, right? And so trying to figure out the standards of what we actually mean from the Bible, and what are those things from which we should shed in our beliefs, because they're more cultural. They're more, I've heard things like white Christian nationalism. Let's just say that. You have a proposition of a list of propositions that define white Christian nationalism. And it's like, if one of those propositions doesn't match with, like, you believe it, actually, you didn't know it was there, but you kind of believe it, and you find that this proposition, the scriptures, now that you understand it, they actually are militate against that, then you need to shed it. This is something that you need to critically look at. And that's so important that we're all doing that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on anything I've just said, but really even taking this and applying it to the idea of Christianophobia. I'm so interested in this concept that basically Well, maybe I can have you define Christianophobia. I mean, I could tell you what I think it is, but I would love for you to define it for our audience. And how does this like interact with this identity issue that we're wrestling with?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking maybe this illustration is better for looking at something like confirmation bias, that we filter out ideas that violate our previously assumed ideas.
Right.
Yeah, I think that is because that's what confirmation bias is, that we dismiss arguments and ideas that go against our beliefs, and we'll accept those that accept it. I think that's really,
So we do have to be careful, right?
right.
And
Yeah,
we aren't just going
and
into
you're right.
confirmation
As far as
bias.
our
Yeah.
culture, I think about, I think a thoughtful Christian will constantly test his or her ideas against and make sure that the culture is not overly influenced. I say overly because you can't. There's no way I can take away all cultural impacts on my faith. I
Nor
say at
should
the
we.
core, here it is, but how I live it out, my culture is going to play a role. But I can do my best to make sure it's not overly influenced. And so that, I think that's what we should be on the guard for. Yeah, the Christianophobia piece of this, in many ways, is a reflection of some of the things about identity politics and such. I define Christianophobia as the unreasonable hatred or fear of Christians. Christianophobia, in a global sense, you know, probably Christians of every stripe suffer from Christianophobia in a global sense. And you can look at what's happening in Nigeria and Sudan and places like that. And from what I've read, that Christians are the most persecuted group around the world. In the United States, Christianophobia, though, tends to manifest itself against conservative Christians. And the reason why that is that the groups that tend to have the cultural power, at least up to recently, have been more progressives who tend to have Christianophobia. The research shows that people who are more politically progressive, who don't go to church, who are white, who are wealthy, who are educated, who are male, they're more likely to have Christianophobia. And so those are people who are more likely in charge of the culture. And so conservative Christians tend to see progressive Christians as Christians who are wrong in some things, but they're still Christians. A lot of progressive Christians, I found evidence of Christianophobia, a really deep fear and hatred. And by progressive, by the way, I mean theologically. I'm not talking about politically. I mean theologically progressive Christians. And so, you know, people don't, for whatever reason, people don't seem to launch that sort of hatred towards progressive Christians. Not nearly to the same level. When we look at surveys and we ask about mainline Christians, they don't gather nearly the same hatred and animosity as conservative Christians do. So when I talk about Christianophobia in the United States, I am looking at it directed at conservative Christians because that's what's happening. And that's the sort of nature it's taking place.
Does
And by the way, I do think that I do think it's gotten worse over the past several years because of the rise of Trump and MAGA and that sort of connection. I can't prove it, but I've seen at least some indirect evidence that's gotten worse.
Yeah, that was going to be somewhat of my question, and feel free to answer it kind of however you see fit. Because before I was a Christian, I was a black progressive living in California. I was an atheist, and I hated Christians. If you had told me that I would end up marrying a pastor's kid in 2008, I would have laughed at you. But I understand, sort of somewhat of this Christian phobia stuff, especially as a progressive, because most of the Christians I think that I had issues with were conservative, and this was early 2000s or what have you. But I'd love to hear what's your thinking on Christian phobia on both sides. So any sort of animosity towards theologically progressive Christians and then on the right. I'd love to just hear you, wax eloquent.
Yeah. When it comes to theologically progressive Christians, you've seen in the past few years some books coming out critiquing them. we did do some research where we asked Christians on both sides questions about each other. And generally, I mean, obviously some of the answers from some conservative Christians were very hostile. But for the most part, they tend to see progressive Christians as, yeah, they're Christians. They're wrong about some things. They're off here and there. They're still Christians. A kind of weaker form of Christians. Not as good of Christians as I am, but kind of weaker form of Christians. From the other side, it was very, very hostile. And some of the progressive Christians did not think conservative Christians were really Christians. So and it wasn't just our qualitative work. It was also quantitatively when we had them assess each other. Same thing. Conservative Christians like progressive Christians better than vice versa. So if you look at just the sphere of Christianity, you see this difference. Now, if you take it out, if we're talking about non-Christians and their attitudes, I've not seen any research showing non-Christians having excessively hostile attitudes towards progressive Christians. And my thinking, because I do remember I did this one study where I asked some academics how they felt about mainline Christians. And my feeling was that they kind of saw them as more acceptable. And of course, professors are more progressive, and so that may have been why they're some more acceptable. Maybe I suspect if I was asking, say, a secular MAGA person, that may be different. Whereas with conservative Christians, then I saw more Christianophobia. So, in the United States, that's why I really see it as something that conservative Christians deal with much more than progressive Christians. Now, worldwide, that's a different issue altogether. I think worldwide, you're a Christian, we're going to destroy your church or what have you. But I think in the United States, that is where the issue is.
This is such an interesting thing to me because my bias, especially being so conservative in my upbringing, evangelical in my upbringing, Pentecostal in my upbringing, there was always a narrative that the culture is against us. Always. Mm-hmm. Actually, this is the first time, oddly enough, this is the first time I felt like, man, the culture is like very much in this like real, like, I don't know, there's a rise of this kind of certain kind of evangelicalism. Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I'm seeing it and I'm like, and it's very, very political. Like I remember growing up and I never heard a pastor say that if you vote Democrat, you are going to hell or you're not a Christian. I never heard that until I actually got to Ohio. It's the first time I actually, and then was listening to Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and really still respect him, listen to him every day. But then and it was always kind of towing the line, not sure to say it. I mean, obviously there was issues and that you have with the Democratic Party. He's very vocal about that, but wouldn't go and say you have to vote for Republican Party. And then he actually did saying that if you're a Christian, or at least strongly implying that. I had to go get the actual quote. But like I never like saw this, but then it kind of has grown in this sense. And Will has been told that, and Will has been a Democrat Christian for a long time. And I know you're not a Democrat, but a progressive, very liberal, and has heard this kinds of stuff. And I was even told things like and basically believed, mainline people, they're not even Christians. I mean, I had that attitude. They're not even Christians. I mean, the difference between what they think and what I think and what they believe and what I believe, at least in my perception, was so, so different. And I think that, like, that's kind of a scary thing, this idea that we're actually practicing two different religions. This kind of idea, like, if you look at the virtues, if you look at the values, sometimes you can actually get to the place where some people have claimed we're actually talking about two different religions. I know Machen was one of a theologian that claimed that about, I believe it was Machen. He essentially came to the place where liberal Christianity isn't Christianity. That's what he said. I mean, and 100 years ago or more. And he makes those arguments. And I guess, like, what is this just a metaphor? are we talking about different like core beliefs to the extent that you could say one was Christian, one was not? Is that sociologically viable? I'm talking about it not on a theological viewpoint, by the way, which I'm happy for you to bring in whatever theology you want, but on a sociological viewpoint, when you look at them, are we talking about two different things? Or are we talking about just the same thing, different flavor?
Yeah.
You know, does the question make sense?
I think so. In fact, I heard really two questions in there. The first one is about, the politicizing of conservative Christians. And I think this is one of the reasons why I got more interested in what's happening around Charlie Kirk. I mean, beyond the tragedy and everything, of course. I think that represented this sort of development of this sort of very political form of conservative Christianity. And I think it is a form of conservative Christianity. It's not conservative Christianity of itself. A lot of conservative Christians are not that political, as I said. But there are those who believe that as part of their Christian faith, you vote Republican. And Kirk was part of that. And his assassination, I think, has, in my opinion, created a spark to allow this group to grow. Now, maybe it would have grown anyways because of his talents, because I've seen more Kirk past month than I had before my whole life. And he had charisma. He's very talented. I mean, however you agree with him or not, very talented. But maybe, this may even emerge out. Southern Baptist, where I used to be a part of, political Christianity is really taking over there. So I do see this emergence of this very masculine, if you will, conservative Christianity, a mega Christianity. I don't know what exactly to call it, but it is emerging and it's going to be its own form. The other question you talked about is now remember, I'm not talking about theologically. I'm not talking about politically. But as progressive and conservative Christianity, are they emerging two different religions? Now, as a sociologist, I don't speak about which one is the true Christian religion. As a sociologist, I don't have the tools to do that.
Yeah.
But I would say that, I think that there are signs that the expression, the values are so distinctive that it's harder to talk about them as being part of the same faith. They have the same symbols, Christ and cross and that sort of thing. But progressive Christians, the way that they interpret their faith is much more along the lines of a type of humanistic cultural values. Here's the example that I like to give. All right, so homosexuality. The conservative Christian will say, and this is a generalization. Christians will say the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. Therefore, what people say, whether it's wrong or not, is irrelevant. The Bible says it's wrong, therefore it's wrong. The rest of the Christians will say, based on my values of inclusiveness, homosexuality is all right. So regardless of what the Bible says, homosexuality is all right. And I don't think I'm exaggerating with this. When I read their work, when we had the interviews, that perspective came out from both sides. The Bible says this is wrong, therefore it's wrong. And if science comes in and says it's right, I still going to believe the Bible, sort of Christian. The homosexuality is we want to be inclusive, we want to be tolerant. Therefore, the Bible says it's wrong, no, we're going to be inclusive and tolerant. And I think that denotes different sources of truth and knowledge. And I think because of that, they are on a pathway towards being distinctive in their religious expression, even though they will keep the name of Christian, both of them, for some time to come.
Yeah, so we live. It's weird. It's like I've been catching myself using kind of the present tense proclamation that we live in very polarized times, because I read a lot of books about polarization from different time periods, and it's like they're like, we live in the most polarized time in America, like all these books throughout history. And I'm like, so when was the most polarized time? Like if now is the polarized time, or was it like 30 years ago? But for all intents and purposes, currently we're living in the most current, up-to-date polarized time in history right now. And I know that you've written a lot about, trying to find common ground, middle ground, especially with Christians, both conservatives and progressives. So I'd love for you to just kind of help us think through how do we have those conversations with somebody on the other side who believes in God, the same God we believe in, and try to help end our polarization. I mean, it'll never be we'll never reach a zero state, right? But at least we can just do a little bit at a time. We can wet that sponge one drop at a time, and eventually it'll be fully wet. So.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what our goal is. I think an ideal goal would be some degree of respect and tolerance for each other. I think that's achievable. I think, on racial issues, I think there's a possibility of emerging together in time. I think it's going to be a lot of hard work, but we could work on our problems and there could be a sort of emerging together. I don't know whether that can be the case with progressive and conservative Christians, emerging together. I'm not talking about respecting one another, having tolerance, humanizing each other. Those should be givens. But as far as other than, there are certain causes that they can work together, like human trafficking. I can see something like that. But as far as working together, because the goals seem so distinct from each other, that I'm not certain that that's plausible without one group or the other dramatically changing its goals. So yes, I'm pessimistic about that. I'm actually more optimistic, and I'm not very optimistic about this, but I'm actually more optimistic that we can solve our racial problems more easily than we can with this divide in the Christian world.
I just one quick follow up. Does the topic of discussion, you think, have a bearing for progressive and conservative Christians when engaging? Because you stated, there's probably a higher chance of reconciliation or getting along with somebody on the topic of race, but probably not so much on, and you didn't say this, but, I'm guessing that it probably not as much on homosexuality or abortion, because in my mind, I think those are two topics or issues that are grounded on theological interpretations and differences. So I'd love to hear, do you think race is sort of unique in the sense that, at least in our current day, there's not as much debate about biblical interpretations about racism?
Yeah, I think theologically there's probably not a lot of difference between, if you're really looking at just the basics of what is race. I don't think there's a lot of differences theologically between the conservative and progressive Christians. How to deal with the racial problems, but how much of that is based, when a conservative Christian says the way we deal with racial problems is that we treat everyone alike and we ignore race. I understand that they may get that theologically from something like Galatians 3:28, but I don't think there's a really wealth of, because race didn't really exist the way it existed today back then. So you don't have a solid theological framework surrounding that. You have some principles, but you don't have, so I think that makes it more immutable. And there's a lot of conservative Christians who are concerned about institutional racism, who engage in a more progressive racial ideology. A lot of African Americans who are very conservative theologically on race are more progressive. And so I don't think that is as grounded as the issues you're bringing up on homosexuality and abortion and things of that nature. Yeah.
So I am a white Christian, conservative, heterosexual male. And I have very, very conservative views. Have had them. And, I'm much more open now to the data, where it leads, and really listening to anything. And that's part of what I've done on this podcast is listen to so many different people that it just changes you. I don't know what to tell you. It's not even it's not even an intentional thing. It just changes you. You can't help it. You're getting this interaction. You're getting questions that come in your mind. You're wondering, talking to Matthew Vines, God and the Gay Christian, and he's like, I want to be conservative. I believe in the absolute authority of God's word, and he's interpreting it and bringing in marriage as, a legitimate, like same-sex marriage, monogamous same-sex marriage as a legitimate expression of sexuality, and going to the Bible to make these arguments. Right. So you have someone, he would consider himself a progressive Christian. I guess if you push him, he would reject many of the things I think that progressive Christianity might put forward and the way that I think you've defined it. He would reject that, especially about the authority of the Bible. He's very adamant about that he was very high proponent of authority, inspiration. I don't know if he said inerrancy, but it was a very high view of Scripture. And I'm looking at this and I'm almost like this representative of like the boogeyman to so many different groups of people. The one that will, in the narrative I've heard, right? I'm separating reality from narrative right now. In the narrative that I've heard, it's that there's white privilege. This is clear. Male privilege. This is historically clear. There is heterosexual privilege. This is historically clear. This is the narrative I've heard. And you are actually at the intersection of all sorts of power. And that makes you inherently, I don't know, dangerous maybe not bad. Maybe some people would think it bad, but dangerous maybe, especially given your views. And looking at this, I guess my question is, why, if there's this narrative that I've heard so much, the things you're telling me are very different from that, I guess is what I'm getting at. The idea that Christianophobia, now it is a narrative that's been in the conservative churches that we're persecuted, that we should, be afraid. This has brought a lot of political action. I think there's a reason why there's so much more politicization. And I think personally, my view is it's a response to the Obama years, personally, and this sense of the progressive movement of the country in massive ways that I think there's a bunch of conservatives like, oh, wait, we really are losing the country. And they've been telling them to vote time and time again and pushing voting. And we need to start doing the same thing. We need to get people out there voting because that's how you get things done in America. And we need to preserve our country and whatever. Why is there this narrative? I guess if the facts are pointing to different things, like there is Christianophobia, that these issues of race that, it seems reasonable to me, the things you're saying, there's issues on both sides. It's not just the white men hold all the power and all the cards and everyone else has to bow down and listen to what they're saying, at least and not now in the current cultural milieu. Why are there such different narratives? And how do we actually figure out what the freaking truth is and not just talk past each other? You know what I'm saying? Because when you're talking about progressive Christians and conservative Christians, I mean, Will is a progressive Christian, right? And so by that definition, I and Will would not be actually in the same religion, potentially. I haven't gone and looking at everything that, sociologically, I haven't gone and looked at everything that Will believes and whatever. And I'm not saying that, but and that's a hard thing. That's a hard pill for me to swallow. But I'm willing to potentially, if the data is really, that's what it's saying. And obviously Will is a person, he's nuanced. He doesn't just do everything that every other progressive Christian does, right? So all those caveats.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure Will the progressive Christian way that I've talked about it. I've talked about Christians theologically. I'm not asking theological questions. He may be a sort of Christian who votes for progressives. That's a different thing than a progressive Christian. So I don't know if Will wants to get into it or not. I want to be clear.
I'm right here, guys. I'm right here.
I'm sorry, man.
Excuse me. I'm here.
So anyway, I just want to be clear on that. But I think, and this is what got me interested in identity politics, because I think that answers a lot of these questions. What kind of happened, and I don't know how much to get into this. In the middle of last century, progressives came to a conclusion. They had been pushing Marxism and communism, and it was going nowhere. The Cold War, people were like, we don't want anything about communism, Marxism, socialism. That's red stuff. We don't want it. So what happened is the left began to transition towards identity politics. Identity politics is politics built around helping marginalized, oppressed groups. So instead of Marxism, which in theory, whether you like Marxism or not, was to help everyone, except for a few of the bourgeoisie, identity politics was bringing up this group and that group and this group because they're oppressed. And that went along for half a century. And it got some fits and starts and became part of the civil rights movement. So the social identity politics, then, of course, it has a framework of oppressor and oppress. And yes, you would be the classic oppressor in the idea of identity politics. All right? Around 2012, for whatever reason, a lot of attention became in the media and academia came on issues of discrimination, and that really pumped up the support for identity politics. So then 2020 comes around. Well, before I get to 2020, 2016 comes around. Trump begins to do his version of identity politics, only now the oppressed are white and Christian. And, there's going to be reams of books written on how Trump won in 2016. But in the end of things, he won a few key states by slim margins. And who was the difference? For working class whites. So that was a big part. And so that kind of kicked off a conservative version of identity politics now. So now in 2020 comes along, and you get, George Floyd and Arbery and all the protests and everything like that. And, what all that does then is it reinforces identity politics. And now we've got a backlash to it. So part of what I think you're talking about is, was a narrative. I think identity politics is at the center of the narrative. Now, my personal opinion is that identity politics gives you a sugar rush. You get a short-term victory, political victory. But because you start creating enemies, because, I know you're too nice to say this, but when you hear things such as like ending whiteness and yes, every man, you probably feel a little bit defensive, which would be natural.
Absolutely.
You're too nice to be of the opposition, but there are others who are going to be of the opposition. But that's what you expect. And I tell my conservative friends, look, you think you're going to be in power forever, but so did the progressives in 2020. You better think about how you're treating the people who you have power over right now, because they're going to do the same thing back to you unless you figure it out. Until we figure it out and break out of this cycle and try to find solutions for everyone, not that everyone gets everything they want, but that we can agree together, this is what we're trapped into. And the church can be part of the solution. But unfortunately, too often, we're part of the problem.
Man, I mean, I could keep talking to you. I seriously have so many questions, a list of like 20 questions I didn't even ask. That's not even the list of Will's questions that he had. We'll have to have you back on because you're right at the intersection of what we're dealing with, what we're thinking about. I agree. Identity politics is on both sides, and they're taken up because it's so stinking powerful. It is so powerful to do it and to label others as an enemy. It just, it hijacks. It gets right in there and it gets right to the core, like those primal parts of us, the tribal parts of us that are like, these people are a threat and we need to get them out of here. we know what to do with power. And so I just appreciate you so much. How can people follow you, see your work? Basically, shameless plug. Now's your time to do it. Tell them how to get involved, buy your stuff, become millionaires through your $9.99.99 package a month. So just do that.
Well, I mean, I published several books on Amazon, some academic, some Christian. Yancey is Y-N-C-E-Y, include the E because there is a George Yancey out there that publishes on race, and I'm not him. And we have kind of different ideas. If you want to come to my YouTube channel, where I cover a lot of this in different videos. They're like about 10 minutes, the videos are. It's Shattering Paradigms. And I hope to create space there. And, ideally, I work at Baylor. So if you ever wanted to email me, go to Department of Sociology at Baylor, and you can get my email address, and you'll find me. I'm not hard to find.
Well, I really appreciate it. And we're going to put all those, we'll put links rather to your, to the podcast and all that in the description. And again, thank you, George. It's been a pleasure to have this time.
Thanks. Both of you have been great.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and listeners, guys, thanks for joining. Like, subscribe, do the stuff that gets this great content out there. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but up.